I am absolutely delighted and very honored to host her event for her debut of her memoir, which is Welcome to Kimmensville, Population 17 and a half. Lisa will be signing books following her event. The book is about Kimmensville, which was a place in time, the dream of 5 separate families. This book is a bittersweet memoir about the mischievous adventures of the Kimmensville Club and their magical neighborhood in northeastern Ohio before the suicide of Lisa's beloved younger brother, Danny. These kids grew up in the 70s and 80s on their grandfather's golf course, surrounded by family and friends. These kids ruled their neighborhood and had the adventures of their lives until a sudden tragedy hit them. Lisa's story follows the family and how the aftermath of Danny's death impacted each of them over the span of 30 years. I was riveted by the memories Lisa shares with us in minute detail, starting with her shocking raw chapter entitled Summer of 1984. Lisa's book ends as it begins with honest reflection. It includes encouragement and an example of how a healing process can be positive. At the very end of her book, in the epilogue, Lisa says that her goal was to thoughtfully tell this story about her unique childhood and her gentle and selfless brother from a sibling's perspective. By all accounts, she has achieved this, and I hope you enjoy Lisa's presentation, and I hope you enjoy her book. May we all give Lisa Church a great book passage welcome.
Thanks, everybody. We lived a bittersweet life in a Midwestern town where some made it out, others stayed, and one left us way too early. Our neighborhood on Kimmins Road shared laughter, love, small dreams and big dreams, and we had each other when tragedy struck. I wrote this book to share the story of our cast of characters, and especially the story of my beautiful brother, Danny. The summer of 1984, I lost my only brother to suicide. Danny was only 14 years old. I was 16, Sue was 18, and Amy was 6. The past 3 decades, each one of us has grieved in our own way, but the common theme for all of us is that things were never the same again. And no one expected it. We were really shocked. Danny appeared to have it all. He had good looks, he was athletic, artistic, funny, smart, and the crush of just about every girl at his junior high. He wasn't bullied or picked on, and he didn't seem depressed. It was just your typical teenage moodiness. But we never saw it coming. His friends did, though. He actually made a pact with a friend to also kill himself that night, but fortunately for that kid's family, he didn't go through with it. Dan even called a girl and said goodbye hours before. He told his friends, but they just didn't think he was serious. When I go home for visits, we sit at my sister's dining room table and we reminisce over the many antidotes. We laugh at our mischief and we cry about our losses. And as Mari said, my goal was to thoughtfully tell the story about our unique childhood, about my gentle, selfless brother from a sibling's perspective. But let me start by telling you a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Kimmensville. Kimmensville had a population of 17 and a half when the street signs were installed by our mayor, Ronnie Lowers. The half was referring to my cousin Andy, who was still in Aunt Leanne's womb when the adults decided to christen the neighborhood. Naming our close-knit quarter after our street, Kimmins Road, was Ronnie's idea during one of the afternoon barbecues hosted at the Lowers residence during our hot summer months. The 5 plots of land that were gifted to my mom and her 4 siblings, one of them's here today, it stretched a 1/10 of a mile down Kimmins Road, and it lined the back 9 of the Elms Golf Course. Howard Black found it to be the quietest spot on the 27-hole golf course that he created. My grandfather hoped his kids would raise their families together on the land where he worked so hard to build his dream. Howard's 3 youngest children fulfilled that dream and eventually built their homes in a row in the order in which they were born. The open space and warm summers in Northeast Ohio allowed us all to plant gardens. 2 families had barns that housed horses and ponies, and we all had dogs that were named after presidents for some reason. And some homes had swimming pools, basketball hoops, and trampolines. And the kids of Kimmensville, we shared a special bond, Most of us were cousins. When we discovered the small brick house that sat next to the red barn and separated the farmhouse from the apple orchard and golf course, all of the neighborhood kids agreed. With a little care and attention, it had potential. As we decorated, we all imagined it would be so much fun to have our own little meeting place, and that's exactly what transpired. Our clubhouse was physically complete, but our clique was still lacking in identity. While the second coat of paint was drying, we roamed the golf course and climbed the apple trees in the orchard. And later that afternoon, had our first meeting at the clubhouse and was called to order. We decided the first piece of business was to determine the name of our new congregation. We ate banana chips from Aunt Leanne's and Little Debbie snack cakes confiscated from my house for our opening ceremony. We brainstormed names to identify our circle of friends. After laughing over some of the juvenile and foul suggestions contributed mostly by the boys, we unanimously voted on Kimmensville Club. And this was in honor of the community our parents inaugurated and the close union our gang had formed at such a young age. We were an ornery crew. We really were. We were little shits. We wreaked havoc across the neighborhood, on the golfers, anyone driving by. Our parents would let us roam free until they whistled or called for us to come home. And if we didn't want to come home, we just acted like we didn't hear them. It was truly a magical place to grow up. On calm summer evenings, the fireflies would light up the course like an airport runway. We captured them in jars and made glow-in-the-dark jewelry out of their torsos. Danny, Jimmy, and I would snatch the golf balls that landed close to our yard and then sell them back to the golfers. Sue borrowed Danny's bow and arrow one afternoon and missed the bale of hay she was shooting for and parted the hair of a golfer instead. And on the fall evenings, we would shuck hog corn and throw them at the neighbors' windows. The bullets, it sounded like bullets hitting glass, but we called it cornin'. We also nicknamed our golf course manager, my mom's cousin Mark Sweeney, Weenie, the day he ripped down our tree house that we built in the orchard. And Mayor Ronnie taught all of us to burp ferociously on command. I was his best student, but I won't, On cold winter days, we would build forts in the front yard to protect ourselves from snowball fights. And we'd inhale the helium from the balloons that we'd get at McDonald's and would imitate the munchkins to the patrons in our new voice. We'd always grab the paper-covered straws on our way out so we could make spitballs and shoot them at people. Whenever my mom was confronted by a spitwad victim, she always acted like it was the first time we had assaulted someone with a soggy paper bullet. And usually the advice the strangers gave her was, you need to discipline your kids. We also made prank phone calls. We just dialed random numbers, and our favorite one being, is John there? And when they usually said, no, I'm sorry, there's no John here, we would say, then what do you pee in, a Dixie cup? And Danny and his friend taught Amy foul nursery rhymes, and we would convince her to recite them to our parents when they were with their friends. One time we got her to answer the phone with the greeting, it's doobie time. It was our dad. But the worst and almost fatal pranks we pulled was the day we drained oil from a corroded tractor and told Danny it was root beer. Or when we convinced him his spongy blue Nerf ball was cotton candy. Both times, Dad had to rush Danny to the ER to have his stomach pumped. But my favorite memory of growing up with Danny was the night my mom went into labor with our little sister, Amy. Sue, Danny, and I saw it as an opportunity to sneak out of the house. And we accidentally got my brother kidnapped by an old neighbor with a gun. And I ended up in the emergency room with 25 stitches in my shin. We were 8, 10, and 12. It was the summer of 1978. The gang was trying desperately to find ways to prolong the beautiful July evening when Dad rushed my mom to the hospital. I reminded everyone that Mr. Reed had been nagging us all school year about standing in his yard while we waited for the bus. Jimmy, Carlene, and Sandy went home to dress in black clothes and prepare to sneak out of the house after dark. We would all meet on the golf course near the outhouse and plan the details of our reckoning on old Mr. Reed. We thought we were stealth, sneaking up on the small yellow house occupied by a retired couple as if we were a Green Beret team. And once we were in place surrounding the front door, we whispered, 1, 2, 3, and we began banging on the brown metal screen door with all of our might. After about 5 pounds each, we planned to run back where we came from. We only wanted to create enough noise to scare the geezer from his slumber, and that's when our plan failed us. The door flew open on our third knock, and Mr. Reed, with his bulging belly straddled by overstretched suspenders, was standing in the doorway with a rifle. He swiftly reached down with his free hand to grab the nearest child, and my 8-year-old brother was closest to his grasp. The old man yanked Danny by the wrist and lifted him in the air like a rag doll. We screamed as one. The frightened look on Danny's face was the last thing we had seen before the door slammed and our little brother became a kidnapping victim of this greasy-haired ogre who brandished a gun to minors. Afraid to confront a psycho with a rifle, we decided to run home and solicit help from an adult. Sue, Carlene, Jimmy, Sandy, and I ran as fast as our legs could carry us, across the backyard, over the creek, and through the golf course. Exhausted and hurried when we reached my cousin's backyard, a few of us took a shortcut through Aunt Leanne's garden and stomping on her precious plants in a rush to save Danny. I never saw the remnants of a steel pole protruding from the ground that long ago supported an old swing set, but now was used as a stake to bear tomato plants in the spring. I was wearing jeans and I didn't realize the damage it had done to my shin when I felt the impact of running straight into the pole and fell to the ground. My dear sister and friends did not miss the opportunity to laugh at me because I tumbled. I jumped up quickly and casually asked Jimmy if I could use his bathroom. He reminded me to be quiet. We did not want to wake his family. I carefully lifted my injured leg onto the countertop and I dreaded what I was about to see. I easily pulled the pant leg of my bell-bottom jeans over my knee and my stomach fell when I discovered the bloody inside of my shin and the bone that sat not far below the surface. I must have been in shock though. My first thought was how much it resembled a slice of pizza after you remove the cheese and all that's left is that bumpy crust with the remnants of tomato sauce. But my love of pizza did not stop me from screaming. I shrieked until I woke up the entire Espinosa household. Once Jimmy's parents saw the degree of my wound and learned of Danny's kidnapping, they had no choice but to call my dad. The sergeant arrived with hat in hand to retrieve his daughters and acknowledge the news of his son's kidnapping. At home, I sat on my bed, covering the wound with the bloody towel the Espinosas insisted I keep, while Dad went to save Danny. We both regretted putting our little brother in this situation and imagined how terrified he must be. When about 15 minutes later, we were thrilled to see our scared little guy walk through our bedroom door, but sad to see his tear-stained cheeks. Danny assured us he was fine, but he was clearly traumatized by the frightening ordeal. When I heard the engine still roaring, I hobbled to the driveway and jumped into the truck to take Danny's seat. I had no choice but to endure my father's surly mood and admonishment on the drive to the Maslin ER before I surrendered myself to the medical staff on duty. They shaved a patch of hair from my leg, shot a numbing agent into my shin with a long needle, and continued to suture 25 stitches to close the gaping hole. During the excitement, my dad visited Mom 2 floors above in the maternity ward. It was past visiting hours, so he had to explain the situation to the nurse behind the desk. And that early July evening, we set a record when 3 Gossages were patients at the Maslin Hospital at the same time. But the Kimmensville Club didn't always terrorize everyone and the people around us. We had some good days. On calm days, we would climb the apple orchard and just sit around and chat with each other. We'd sit under this big weeping willow tree near the pond and attempt to fish. On warm days, we would sell lemonade to the golfers for 25 cents a glass. And after the course cleared in the evenings, we'd play kickball until as the sun was setting. Other days we'd parade down Kimmens in crazy outfits, banging instruments as our parents stood in the driveway and waved. And we loved plays and performances. We were constantly performing for each other. Danny, though, was always the most entertaining, except when he burst into a ballad in the middle of General Hospital. Then Sue and I would have to pummel him. And on rainy days, a gigantic water slide would form at the bottom of our house, at the bottom of this hill behind our house, and the neighbor kids would use it as a slip and slide all afternoon. And in the fall, Weenie would let us pick apples from the orchard, and our dads would drive them to Amish country and we'd make fresh apple cider. In the winter, the pond would freeze over and we would ice skate all afternoon and then make snow angels all over the course. And Danny and I loved to bake. We made endless calls to our grandma. Can we substitute baking powder for baking soda? And what in the heck do you mean by oleo? We made up cheers begging Mayor Ronnie for pizza and ice cream, and it always worked. And when we ran out of ideas, Aunt Leanne would quell our boredom by hosting Craft Day. And I just loved Craft Day. Another rock star in Kimmensville was my mom, Betty Gossage. My mom was the center of our world and known to every child she met as Mother Goose. Our fun-loving parent did not work outside of the home, but decided that even house cleaning came second to playing with us. She always had time for her own children, as well as any kid in the neighborhood or school that needed her. We all felt cherished when my mom was around. Ours house was the house where all the kids played. And my mom would take as many kids as she could fit into her car, and sometimes more, to doctor's appointments, grocery shopping, movies, out to eat, parks. She'd even take the kids to Catholic church that weren't Catholic because they knew we stopped for donuts on the way home. And we always wrote her thank you notes, and she still has them today. Once she drove Sue, Danny, and I to Florida to visit her family. The 16-hour drive took 3 days because of the number of stops we made. We didn't even leave Ohio until the afternoon of day 2. And Danny just adored her. He used to tell her he wanted to marry her when he grew up. He picked her dandelions every day after kindergarten. She said they were always wilted, but she still put them in a small glass with cold water and displayed them on the kitchen table. He also said he was going to buy her a red dress and new carpet when he got his first job. I know he would have followed through with his promises if he could have. We created an incredible community, although a little unwieldy at times, and genuinely had the perfect world growing up on the Elms golf course. However, when we reached our teens, we were encouraged to look for work. My mom found out that we were charging after-school snacks to a grocery account. So we started with a 3-mile paper route, but it only netted us enough money for chips and pop for the walk home. So then I moved on to babysitting, which is a little more lucrative, and my sister Sue became a salad girl at a local restaurant. Unfortunately for one guest, this was during her Lee press-on nail phase. I think he thought it was a radish. Then she started working at a record store that also sold concert tickets, albums, waterbeds, and bongs. And in the summer, we all worked at some capacity for Aunt Margaret at the Elm Swim Club. We also started to get into trouble, but we weren't always caught. We used to borrow the golf carts from the Elms at night and joyride around the golf course, and once to go pick up a pizza. One day, Sue smuggled a 6-pack of beer right past her parents into her bedroom in a laundry basket full of clean clothes. They smiled because they thought she was doing laundry. And when she was 17, she took my dad's truck without permission or a driver's license, hit a car, left the scene of the crime, and basically committed 3 felonies before she was 18. I was also stopped by the cops for speeding and had beer in the car, but thankfully they didn't see the beer. And this behavior was followed by shoplifting, underage drinking parties, and sneaking out of the house. Danny was also growing up. By the time he was 13, most of the calls made to our household were from young girls with high-pitched voices asking for Dan. Our teenage brother was also sporting a soft, fuzzy mustache that covered his upper lip. Danny's thick, silky black hair hung in his eyes most of the time. He would nonchalantly swing his head to the left and toss his hair. He was lucky to inherit our Grandpa Howard's tall frame, dark eyes, cleft chin, and deep olive skin tone. Danny's features were striking as he matured into a handsome young man. My brother was not only good looking, but he also was a natural athlete. He grew up playing sports for the school and city leagues and was often nominated as a captain for his basketball and football teams. And he led his team to many victories, but he wasn't competitive himself. He just enjoyed the camaraderie of his teammates more than the wins. And his good looks and athletic ability were complemented by his sense of humor and intelligence. My brother earned straight A's all throughout school while continuing his quest to give the teachers a hard time. He was also budding into a fine artist. Sue and I were fascinated that he could spend more time sketching than doing homework, but brought home report cards that far surpassed Sue's and rivaled mine. He was also becoming a bit more solitary. Danny was spending his evenings drawing, listening to music, and dancing in his bedroom, but he still maintained his friendships and good grades. My little brother appeared to have the whole package. No one noticed the sadness that was brewing inside of him. Then, the evening of July 15th, 1984, everything changed. I was hanging out with my best friends, cruising around town. My parents and younger sister, Amy, were visiting a state highway patrol colleague of Dad's. Danny assumed he would have the house to himself since Sue was going steady with Chris and it was summer break. He didn't expect our older sister to stay home that night. Sue found our brother in his bedroom with a gunshot wound to his head, and the Prince song, When Doves Cry, was wailing from the stereo. She called for help. Danny used the gun that my dad took to work every day. He kept it in a gun cabinet. It was always locked, but we knew the key was under the wooden mallard duck that sat on top. Danny lived almost 3 days in ICU, but he never regained consciousness. His brain was dead, but his other organs were strong. As a family, we had to make the horrible decision to unhook the machines, but only after we found recipients for his organs. My mom insisted. It was the most dreadful experience you could ever imagine, and my parents divorced immediately. Mom moved Amy and me to Florida 2 weeks before my senior year of high school, and that's when I checked out for a while. I barely graduated, and I intentionally botched my SAT. I made a Christmas tree with ornaments and lights. Sue stayed in Ohio with her boyfriend, whom she eventually married, and they had 2 boys. But she told me later that she felt so abandoned when we left her there. Mom, Amy, and I also struggled in Florida, financially and emotionally. And after spinning out of control for 5 years, we all moved. Me to California, and my mom and Amy went back to Ohio to be near Sue and her family. But the memories of losing her only son flooded back, and it was just too much for my mom. Coincidentally or not, Amy was 14 when she had her first nervous breakdown. And she spent the next 7 years in and out of mental institutions. But we finally found a pharmaceutical cocktail and a few good doctors, and we have our mom back. Her struggle with the loss of her son continues today. How could it not? Mom keeps Danny's robe hanging in her closet, and she kisses it every morning when she wakes up and every night before she goes to bed. His memorabilia is safely stored in Mom's closet, including the pencil sketches we found several months after his passing. When we moved his dresser, we heard something slide down the wall behind it. A cardboard box was stuffed with Danny's drawings, was lying on the floor. I flipped through the stack and quickly searched for the sad little boy that he was drawing the last time I saw him alive. It wasn't there. And I know Danny hadn't intended to devastate the girls he loved the most, but it ripped our hearts out and threw our lives into a tailspin. And over the last 3 decades, his death has caused us all a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, and it always will. But I wanted to end with, why did I write this book, and why now, after 30 plus years? Well, it's a very hard conversation to have, as you can see, and we all blamed ourselves. Some of us still do. But about the time my daughter reached Danny's age, the topic of teen suicide surfaced again. A kid at Tam High jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge the morning of my husband's first day of student teaching. My daughter's friend was cutting herself. And a kid at Tam posted a video on YouTube, said he didn't want to be alive. A few of my friends mentioned their sons were depressed. And who expected to hear the news about Robin Williams? So I just thought, damn, we're not talking about suicide, and it's not getting any better. I taught my daughter to tell me when her friends mentioned hurting themselves. She was never, ever allowed to keep that a secret. And she did tell me on 2 occasions. And we did something, and those kids are still here. I also wanted to share the stories of growing up with Danny that would have gone with us. And I felt as a suicide survivor, as Danny's sibling, and as a mom, I should tell my story. How we suffered after losing him, how we prevailed, and what we learned. We learned that it's a conversation we need to have, and it's a topic that's shoved under the rug. Suicide is a sad, depressing dinner conversation, but it really needs to happen. We need to listen, and we need to pay attention to the people in our lives, and they need to know that they're loved and they have options. If things aren't great at home, I'll bet there's a favorite aunt, uncle, friend, godmother to take you in. Your friends can be some of your best support systems, as you all are. I also learned that suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death for ages 10 through 24, and the 10th leading cause of death across the United States. That's 120 people a day, and it's preventable. But as depressing as these numbers are, I am inspired by some recent initiatives both in my hometown and Marin County. After multiple suicides this school year in one Northeast school district, 6 suicides in one school district in 1 year, that they don't know what to do. They've got counselors, press conferences, but the local newspaper did an article and included my book, as well as a teen initiative called Speak Life, where a group of teens put a social media campaign together where they're encouraging kids to talk if you need to talk and others to listen. Novato High, we just lost 2 teens to suicide. They also just had a teen suicide workshop to try to educate the parents in the school districts. And I don't know if anyone watched the Grammys, but I watched the rap band Logic perform their hit song 1-800-273-8255, which is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I read the next day that their calls spiked 3 times the normal volume for the next 2 hours following the show. So what I learned is if we talk about it, if we remind people there's help, we remind people there's a number to call, maybe they'll use it. And I want to keep that momentum going. The other 3 things I learned is that when people contemplate suicide, they usually don't want to be gone. They just want to be out of the pain that they're in. So listen and pay attention to your loved ones. Talk to them and ask them if they're okay. And please teach the kids in your life to tell you if their friends talk about hurting themselves, because it's bigger than they are. So if you recognize a loved one suffering, or if you relate to Danny, please know there's help. Know that someone cares. We are never alone, and we always have options. And as my good friend and mentor, Mark David, said to me one day, believe there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and believe that you might be that light for someone else. Thank you.